Mitch Horowitz is a well-known and widely known voice of esoteric ideas. He is a writer-in-residence at the New York Public Library, a lecturer-in-residence at the University of Philosophical Research in Los Angeles, and he is the PEN Award-winning author of books including The Miracle Club, How Thoughts Become Reality, Occult America, and One Simple Idea, How Positive Thinking Reshaped American Life. Mitch has written on everything from the war on witches to the secret life of Ronald Reagan for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Salon, Time.com, and Politico. He is the voice of popular audiobooks, including Alcoholics Anonymous and the Jefferson Bible. Mitch has discussed alternative spirituality on CBS Sunday Morning, Dateline NBC, NPR's All Things Considered, and throughout the national media. The Washington Post says that Mitch treats esoteric ideas and movements with an even-handed intellectual studiousness that is too often lost in today's raised voice discussions. This morning, in his lecture on The Secret Doctrine and America, historian and writer Mitch Horowitz considers what HPB's magnum opus said about the future and destiny of the United States, including her early insights into America as an engine of cultural and spiritual progress. Please welcome Mitch Horowitz.
I'm mic'd up. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. I would add to it only that I'm also very proud to be a member of the Theosophical Society, which I have been for many years. And I find it, there's my fellow lodge member, I find it very restful to come to Wheaton because when we hold events as part of the Northeast Federation, the talks are these 6-hour Wagnerian epics where we break for a brief vegetarian lunch, come back, there's a Gnostic mass, there's another 2 hours, and so on, and then we begin. So to speak to you in a relatively short space is a new experience for me. And I'm especially glad to be here to speak on The Secret Doctrine. I decided I would actually bring with me, I travel light, but I decided I'd bring with me my copies of volumes 1 and 2 of The Secret Doctrine. As you can see, they've been well read and gone over. I don't put these little tabs on things just because they look pretty. I put them because this book, for me, as I'm sure for many of you in this room, is an ever-growing catalog of ideas. And it changes as you change. And there are new folds and wrinkles and insights that you find in the book as the years go by. And I tend to travel very light going through this life. People ask me what style my apartment is decorated in, and I respond, Thoreau. I really have a very spare existence, but there are a handful of objects and books that I always keep, and The Secret Doctrine is among them. One of the things I want to say in beginning this lecture is something that's directed not so much to folks in this room, because many of you have been reading The Secret Doctrine for many years, as I have, but maybe for friends of ours who are curious about theosophy, curious about the life and career of Madame Blavatsky. And that is, I feel strongly that it's very important to read books like this one, to read these texts of contemporary mystical and alternative spiritual culture. They're not so far away that they can't be experienced by the individual. There's all kinds of speculation as to what is to be found in these magisterial books like The Secret Doctrine or, for example, G.I. Gurdjieff's magnum opus, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. And our culture has become too attenuated to reading the coverage of things rather than to reading the things themselves. Our generation certainly didn't create that intellectual habit, but we seem to have perfected it. And people will pick through volumes by Blavatsky or Eliphas Levi or Gurdjieff or others, and they will think they've seized upon some point And they might feel very roused and very worked up about whatever point they feel they've seized upon. But it's almost impossible to understand anything in these great books without understanding it in context. It has to be one part of a whole. That's certainly how Madame Blavatsky saw it. And she wasn't making an effort, nor I believe were any of the writers who I've mentioned making an effort to deter the reader. These books absolutely are readable, and I often tell young people that if you can go like that, you can read them. And I very deeply encourage engagement with these books. And the individual who approaches an epic work like The Secret Doctrine and who reads it rather than reads about it will be filled with a sense of nobility and appropriate accomplishment. Whether or not everything in the book touches the heart or the intellect of each individual reader is almost beside the point. But it's an act of really engaging with a body of ideas that have been hugely influential on our contemporary culture, but that, again, go read by only a very, very slender fraction of the people who have heard of these books or who talk about these books online or on late night radio or something of that nature. We're always looking for ways to build a sense of healthful, reasonable self-respect, a sense of nobility, a sense of just and deserved authority. And one way it can be done is by refusing to live in translation, so to speak, but saying, I'm going to delve into this and I'm going to go all the way and I'll see who I am when I come out. And that answer will be different for all of us. One of the things I was always struck by in The Secret Doctrine was the incredible prescience with which Madame Blavatsky wrote about America. America as a nation is mentioned very, very few times over the course of these two volumes. However, what HPB alludes about America was so foresightful and so remarkable that it genuinely gives the sensitive reader pause. When she talks about the Book of Zahn appearing before her, when she talks about receiving communications, whether the Mahatma letters or other communiques that go beyond what we regard as ordinary gathering of information, there's a certain credence that gets lent to that when one realizes how foresightful HPB was in 1888 in foreseeing certain changes in America that really wouldn't begin to even unfold for a few generations until after her death. Most specifically, she alludes to America, and particularly to the southern coast of America, as the the southwestern coast of America, Southern California, as being a kind of place, a womb, a place of gestation, a place where we would begin to see the earliest stirrings in kernel form of a cosmic leap, an evolutionary leap on the greatest scale. That is to say, the development of the beginnings, the earliest stirrings of a sixth subrace within the cosmological scheme of root races, we being currently in that cosmological scheme the fifth subrace of the fifth root race. And as HPB saw it, within the next few centuries, if you're not patient, The Secret Doctrine is not for you. Within the next few centuries, we would begin to see the germination, as she alludes, on the west coast, the southwest coast of America, of the development of a sixth sub-race. And that this sixth sub-race would be indicated, would be marked by a greater degree of intuition, sensitivity, and possession of what we might call a sixth sense, extra abilities that went beyond the five sensory. And it's really just fascinating because she was writing all of this at a time, I mean, look, it was really just, gosh, about 2 decades after the end of the Civil War. America, as we know it today, was only just taking shape, and she was writing this right at the beginning of what was to become a century of really substantial research into ESP, telepathy, psychical abilities on an academic scale that the world hadn't seen before. And there's a great deal more that can be said about that and the manner in which that has continued into our own time. This research is under constant criticism. It's under constant challenge to find funding. It has been, I think, wrongly hounded off of a number of college campuses, not all of them. And it continues today, always struggling to define itself. Parapsychology always struggles to define itself as a legitimate field of clinical study. And yet, on its most serious footing, practiced by people like my friend Dean Radin at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Northern California, or Darrell Bem at Cornell, or my friends at the Ryan Center for Research in Durham, North Carolina. On its most solid intellectual footing, this research has withstood, and the data it's produced has withstood, greater criticism than probably any other field of research, whether in the social sciences, in psychology, in psychopharmacology. And the data that has been produced by this field at its absolute best has never been overturned, has never been overturned. And I write about this in my books, One Simple Idea and The Miracle Club. And it's extraordinary that clinical science, with very little reference to Madame Blavatsky, has produced a body of data, controversial though it may be, that speaks to the existence, that speaks to the measurability, statistically and otherwise, of sensory abilities that go beyond those 5 that we're familiar with. And that was one of the things HPB said would be an indicator of the earliest germination of a 6th root race. Now, she never came right out and said, all this is going to begin to percolate on the coast of Southern California. She made indications that were later developed by Annie Besant, who felt stronger and was more pronounced in her assertion that this is where humanity's next germination would begin to occur. But the very fact that Madame Blavatsky made these observations as early as 1888 is extraordinary. I mean, as those of you who are from California know, at that time, California was ranches, newly laid railroad tracks, oil fields. The gold rush had begun to ebb. It was nothing like the economic and cultural and spiritual engine that we know it as today. It was wide open spaces with some mission houses, again, ranching, agriculture, orange groves. The movie industry was unheard of. The economic boom that lifted California really didn't occur until the age of World War I. The migration of the movie business there really didn't start to occur until the late 19-teens, early 1920s, when the silent film industry began to grow. There were very few voices, literary, spiritual, cultural, even political, coming out of California at that time. It was America's orange grove, to a great extent. And yet she had this insight, this remarkable, remarkable insight that California and the surrounding environs would become this tremendous engine of spiritual progress. She writes in volume 2, it is in America that the transformation will take place and has already begun silently occurring. Those are remarkable lines to have written in 1888. That is a remarkable piece of foresight that I haven't found in any other literature of that time. HPB had, throughout her entire career, a very deep affection for and attachment to America. She lived in America for only a relatively short time in the early to late mid 1870s. But those years, in some regards, were perhaps the most consequential of her career because they served to crystallize her outlook. And when she came to America for the first time in the early 1870s, she said, first of all, she was attracted to the United States because she saw it as the cradle of spiritualism. But she also made the observation, you cannot live in the cradle forever. So she was a sympathetic critic of spiritualism, but nonetheless, she wanted to visit the land where she saw this spiritual revolution bubbling up. And again, her insight was very, very correct. Certainly, the idea of channeling and mediumship and seances and so forth, going under different vocabulary terms, had a much longer and deeper and greater history. But it was in America where these things got formulated into modern movements with clubs and newsletters and churches and societies. And as people in the US began to organize into seance circles in the early 1850s, with instructions from a man who HPB references once in The Secret Doctrine, Andrew Jackson Davis, a young man who was a medium from Poughkeepsie, New York, in the Hudson Valley. They used to call him the Poughkeepsie Seer. This was intended to make fun of him, but he actually liked the label and he began to use it himself. And Henry Olcott also recorded an instance of traveling up to Poughkeepsie to visit Andrew Jackson Davis in about 1845. They were both still very young men, both probably around age 19 at that point. And Davis was a remarkable American figure because he would report the ability to enter into what was then called a mesmeric trance, and he would go into these trance states, and he would come out and he would dictate these vast metaphysical lectures by which people were tremendously excited and aroused. Davis did many, many extraordinary things in his life, and he was a remarkable figure. I do have to share this one footnote. It was noted that the same year that he began to produce his lectures was also the same year that the first popular English translations appeared of the work of Emanuel Swedenborg, and some critics noted a suspicious congruency between Andrew's lectures and Swedenborg's, and Andrew said, well, that's because he's my tutor on the spirit plane. So you can take that as you will, but Davis did do many great things. And one of the reasons why Americans, including Henry Olcott and later Madame Blavatsky, and Madame Blavatsky can be called an American because when she left for India, she was an American citizen, and she remained an American citizen her entire life. And she was very proud of that. I'll say more about that. But one of the reasons that figures like Henry Olcott and Madame Blavatsky and many, many other folk were attracted to Andrew was not only because of the content of his metaphysical lectures, but because his psychical abilities, depending on your point of view, and his emergence as a national figure aroused a hope in many modern people in the West that the age of prophecy was not something that just belonged to the distant past, that we were still capable of receiving messages from beyond the veil, so to speak, within the modern world. And the fact that Andrew was nicknamed the Poughkeepsie Seer made him all the more an appealing figure to Americans. And he intuitively sensed that by claiming that nickname. Again, it was meant to be an epithet. It was meant to be something insulting. Like, who is this kid from the backwaters of Poughkeepsie who thinks he's speaking with the voice of a prophet? But what Andrew grasped intuitively, and I ask you to listen to this very, very carefully, what he grasped intuitively was that the very quality that some journalists and academics saw in him as fodder for ridicule was the same thing that made him appealing to vast numbers of people, which was the idea that the prophet could come from very, very ordinary circumstances. So the fact that his backstory involved growing up as a poor farm kid, becoming a cobbler's apprentice at age 17, being seen as this kind of upstate New York bearded yokel, and he was no yokel. He understood in ways that his critics did not, that very ordinariness was hugely appealing to Americans because it tapped an instinct in people that maybe within this new land, maybe within this new Israel, as some people put it, there could be a new dispensation from God, from the beyond. Certainly Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, felt that way. Certainly Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of the Christian Science movement, felt that way. Certainly lots of spirit mediums who were inspired by Andrew's example felt that way. There was something about Andrew and the other figures of that day in their very ordinariness that drew Americans to them at least as much as the metaphysical messages that were coming from them. And again, so Henry Olcott says, well, gee, here I was, a student who just dropped out of New York University because my father's business went bad. I wasn't sure what my future was. I wasn't sure what lay ahead for me. But I heard about this kid up in the Hudson Valley who could go into these spirit trances and dictate these vast metaphysical treatises. And I want to know about him. And Henry recalled taking a train up to the town of Poughkeepsie, going into a building, walking up to the second floor, and there was Andrew, basically the same age as him. And as Henry recalled it, Andrew was practicing at that time, was practicing a kind of medical psychometry. He took a hair from a man's head and used it to diagnose and prescribe some kind of a cure for the man's disease or ailment. And as Henry recalled it, the subject felt absolutely thrilled and aroused that it was correct, and he experienced some kind of relief. And Henry was hooked. Henry was hooked. That was a pivotal moment in which he came to feel that although he was studying scientific agriculture, there was some unseen current in our world. There was some hidden current. And the fact that it was unfolding in a rickety second floor room off Main Street in Poughkeepsie made it all the more exciting. Henry didn't feel, wow, I have to travel to the monasteries of Tibet and to the sands of Egypt and to the unknown reaches of India. There's the miraculous right here. But, as history tells us, he soon met someone who did travel to all those places. And he was enthralled with her. When Henry first met Madame Blavatsky, there was something about her past, her mystery, that provided him with a unique counterbalance to what he had experienced in Andrew Jackson Davis. If Andrew Jackson Davis summoned Henry to the greatness that could be found in everyday life, his meeting years later with Madame Blavatsky seemed to summon him to a wider, more epic scale of possibilities. And let's face it, this was a guy whose family finances went into the rapids and crashed. He was forced to quit school, which must have been very, very painful for him. You know, Victorian age people didn't talk about their emotions very much at the time. You know, today somebody stubs their toe and it becomes a mini-series. But, you know, Henry was very stoic about it. And, of course, life was more precarious then. Finances were precarious, health was precarious, death was a palpable presence. Childhood diseases claimed lots and lots of lives. And there was frankly, there was a brutality to life that we don't always recognize today. So if somebody had to drop out of school after the first year because dad's finances went bust, it was a tragedy, but it was a tragedy that was experienced often privately. I'm not saying it was necessarily better than what we have today, but it was different. There was a different tone to people's emotional lives. Not always for the better, not always for the better, but that's how it was. And so I think probably when Henry met Madame Blavatsky, not only was he thrilled with her for the reasons that probably any curious person would be, but she seemed to fill a gap in his life that had been lost when he was forced to discontinue his own higher education, at least of a formal sort. Now, I said, Madame Blavatsky mentions Andrew Jackson Davis only once in The Secret Doctrine, and she respected him. She said his metaphysical visions are quite correct, but he doesn't go far enough. He doesn't go far enough. She had already been germinating this idea of deciphering for modern people this vast, unseen, cosmic philosophy that she gave early birth to in Isis Unveiled, she expressed in other ways through her career, and she gave full and complete birth to with the publication of The Secret Doctrine. And although The Secret Doctrine was not written in America, I think the presence of America for her as its receiver, we'll say. I don't think she would have described herself as its author. She probably would have said, look, it was always there. It was always there. I'm the person who brought it to the public. Give me that credit, but don't call it mine. I think that as she was recording The Secret Doctrine, the presence of America was always, always, always hanging over her as an author, because she made the statement that not only did she come to America because she wanted to see Andrew Jackson Davis, she wanted to visit the birthplace of modern spiritualism, but she saw America, and this is very important and something that I'll come back to, she saw America as a place where she could explore her spiritual ideas unharassed and unmolested. And she spoke of the degree of harassment that she would experience back home in Russia, where she would occasionally be followed by secret police, or she would be hauled in for questioning by committing some really very minor infraction, like maybe she would assemble a salon or a study group somewhere, and immediately the Tsar's secret police would want to know, what are you up to? Who do you work for? Are you a spy for Germany? You know, these were the questions. And look, this was a person who held a position of minor nobility back home. So she was shielded from the worst of it. But she still found there was a great deal of limitation. You had to receive the Tsarist government's permission to publish a newspaper, a magazine, a book. There was censorship, there was scrutiny. And she felt she could come to America and be relatively unmolested. And that proved true. That proved true. The only real hassles that she got into in America, at least on a public scale, came from the tabloid press. But she loved jousting with the tabloid press. You know, they couldn't get the better of her, and she would happily sit for interviews, smoking cigarette after cigarette after cigarette, running circles around whatever reporter thought he was going to unmask this Carnival Barker from the East or something like that. So she enjoyed the attention. And she enjoyed, as she put it, the freedom from the molestation, the harassment that she had experienced back home in Russia. So she felt very distinctly that America was a place where she, and later she and Henry, could begin to explore their spiritual ideas. And of course, one of their first projects, albeit a short-lived one, formed the title for my most recent book, which is The Miracle Club. They decided on the west side of Manhattan to get together a small cluster of people, journalists, clergy, scientists, who wanted to study the unknown, who wanted to step up their study of spiritualism and mystical philosophies to a greater level. And this little group, the Miracle Club, was only around for a short time. It never found traction, but she and Henry, of course, came up with an idea that did, which brings us all into this room today, which was the founding of the Theosophical Society in New York City in 1875. Something, frankly, that could not have happened back home in Tsarist Russia. Certainly it was possible in other parts of the Eastern and Western world, but HPB felt that there was a unique openness in America, thanks to people like Andrew Jackson Davis and some of the others I've mentioned. And there was a unique willingness on the part of everyday folk, ranging from agricultural people to professionals to journalists to soldiers, everyday folk, to explore the unknown without anybody's permission, without anybody's approval or approbation. And that was something that was really special. Because in the old world, so to speak, even though there were certainly pockets of freedom and there were places where you could engage in inquiry without feeling harassed, people felt the gravitational ties of church and family and community maybe more strongly. In America, there was greater mobility. I mean, to a very real extent, the country was settled and shaped by this mobility that people experienced. And when they would settle in new cities or towns or villages, very often they would leave behind the churches or the congregations of their childhood, and they were ready and they were prepared to hear new ideas. And by the time HPB and Henry met, Andrew Jackson Davis, sure enough, had already moved to New York City. There were Swedenborgian churches in New York City. There were different reading groups and newspapers and spiritualist clubs in New York City, as well as in other parts of the country. And there was a constituency. There was a willingness to hear and receive ideas. You could publish a book like The Secret Doctrine, Isis Unveiled, and actually have the reasonable expectation that it would find an audience. Andrew Jackson Davis would publish these massive, epic books of metaphysical lectures. There are probably some of them in the Olcott Library. And believe it or not, they would actually sell. In what was still a relatively small, agriculturally based nation, one of Andrew's first books sold 2,000 copies in its first week. I would like that. No, seriously. And could learn from him. People were fascinated. I don't know if they were always reading it, to be perfectly frank, because I can tell you, Andrew's prose was, it wasn't Fitzgerald, but they did buy it, and they were interested, and they were concerned, and they were inspired. And so again, HPB had this prescience about America. And even though she and Henry decided that their destiny and their career and their mission would lay to the East, as I mentioned earlier, she remained an American citizen until her death, and she was very, very proud of that fact. And I don't think it was accidental that her closest Confederate, despite the fact that there was friction between them from time to time, was a colonel in the Union Army, a lawyer, a journalist, Henry Olcott, who had spent time farming in Ohio, running an experimental farm in New Jersey, grown up and worked in New York City. Henry was an American through and through, and she identified him very, very early on as the kind of person who could relate to different groups of people, who had this remarkable ability not to become overly familiar, but to talk to vast ranges of people. And that was something that she was very, very interested in. There was nothing of the hermit in Madame Blavatsky. She wanted to reach an audience. And that's why I'm always telling people that her essays, her articles, her books, they can be read. They're available. They're right there to you. They're not something that's so far away. Now, it's an interesting question, this matter of the cosmic and evolutionary development of different root races and subraces. I hesitate because of the vastness of scale to even talk about this question of root races, because their unfoldment occurs across such vast stretches of time that I think it's difficult in our spiritual imaginations to even conceive of some of these vast stretches. And this is even true of the subraces. But she did place the enticing note in Volume 2 of The Secret Doctrine that the sixth subrace would begin to develop in the next few hundred years. Again, just the blink of an eye in the space of The Secret Doctrine. And that its unfoldment had already begun. Its unfoldment had already begun, which Annie Besant refined and pinpointed to Southern California. So this, to me, raises an interesting question for the individual seeker. And that is, what is our personal responsibility in the midst of all this? The scale of time that transpires within the Secret Doctrine, within HPB's description of the root and subraces, is so vast, and its inevitability so assured on a cosmic scale, that one could justly ask, well, what does it matter what I do? You know, is this just kind of an occult Calvinism where it's just going to unfold and there really isn't anything that I, as the individual, have to do to participate in this? And it's an interesting question. And in that regard, I want to quote from an idea that HPB expresses in Volume 2. She talks about the fact, and I am going to quote directly from the book in a moment. She talks about the fact that this vast unfolding and the march of humanity towards new ways of being, new ways of existing, it's not a neat, orderly line. There are switchbacks in the road, so to speak. It goes back and forth. And I want to, I feel at this conference, a passage should be heard from the Secret Doctrine. So I want to read this very, very short passage from Volume 1, Cosmogenesis. She writes, late in the volume, "We are, however, cycling back and cycling forward, i.e., having lost in spirituality that which we acquired in physical development until almost the end of the fourth race. We, mankind, are as gradually and imperceptibly losing now in the physical all that we regain once more in the spiritual re-evolution. This process must go on until the period which will bring the sixth root race, on a parallel line with the spirituality of the second long extinct mankind. So she felt that as humanity had entered more concretized physical forms, it had lost some of its spiritual essence. So something from the past, the distant past, needed to be regained, recultivated. And she felt that, in some respects, the mission of the sixth root race ultimately would be the reintegration of the spiritual with the physical, the reintegration of the spiritual with the physical. So this vast march of cosmic evolution wasn't necessarily so neat and orderly. Something would be gained, something would be lost. And integration, as she saw it, was the aim of this next vast evolutionary cycle. So, again, as I was rereading this, I found myself asking, what's the role of the individual in this? Do we help this evolution in some way, or do we just kind of get carried along with it like, little paper boats along a current? And I don't have a hard and fast answer for that. I think that's something that each individual has to incorporate into his or her own search. But I do feel a sense of certainty, at least based on personal experience, that whether or not our individual activities figure into this march of cosmic evolution, we are profoundly responsible on an individual scale for the role that we play within it. And it seems to me that each of us has a unique responsibility if we really wish to participate as beings possessed of full perception and engagement in this cosmogenesis that HPB is talking about. We possess the choice. We possess the choice to cultivate awareness of what's going on within our world, both on the cosmic scale and individually and internally and within. And I think we also, and of course, a lot of you are participating in the community service projects this weekend, I think we also have to see that responsibility apropos the communities that we live in, apropos how we relate to other people, our relationships. And I wonder sometimes what Madame Blavatsky would think, frankly, of the culture that exists in our nation today. I avoid the nostalgia of thinking there was some good old days, Boy, when she came here, everything was great, it wasn't great. We were going through, a brutal Reconstruction in the South. Black Americans were living under horrific Jim Crow laws. There were all kinds of things that were brutal in life at that time. So I want to resist the temptation to feel that, everybody walking down the street was Jimmy Stewart, and everything was just fine, back in the 1870s. So I'm not trying to get myopic in that way, but I am cognizant, and it is true, that HPB came here because she felt very strongly that she could pursue her spiritual ideas and outlook and organization without feeling harassment. And she did foresee, she absolutely foresaw America as the birthplace of this early germination of the sixth root race. So she saw America as a place of destiny. There's just no question about that. That's not just some sort of flag waving or cheerleading. That was her perception. And that was also the perception of Manly P. Hall. That was the perception of many different people around the world who were adopting spiritual practices from America. That was the perception of Swami Vivekananda, who came to America in the 1890s, loved it, stayed here a relatively long time. That was the perception of one of my great heroes, a French mind theorist named Émile Coué, who I write quite a bit about. He was one of the pioneers of autosuggestion and positive mind metaphysics, and he took a special liking to America. This wasn't just a kind of fuzzy, appealing point of view. It was a widely held perception in the Western and various parts of the Eastern world that the United States in the mid to late 19th century and beyond was a unique springboard of spiritual ideals and spiritual freedom. And I think that was true. There were lots of other things going on, some of them criminal, some of them shameful, but the presence of that spiritual possibility was absolutely true. HPB put her finger on it. She was one of the early figures from the old world who saw and understood that in its fullest sense. And she saw, I mean, look, I would say earlier than anybody else on the world scene, Madame Blavatsky did foresee the development of this vast, deeply influential alternative spiritual culture on the West Coast. People today scratch their heads and ask themselves, why? Why is the West Coast the cradle for so much that's spiritually innovative? And everybody has their own different answer. You talk to one person, he or she will say, it's the weather. You talk to another, they'll say it's the light. You'll talk to somebody else, they'll say, oh, it's all those nuts in the movie industry. They'll believe anything, you know. Everybody has their own pet theory and answer. But, if I may say, using Occam's razor as my guide, the simplest one and the one that covers the most bases is the one that Madame Blavatsky offered in 1888, which is that there is a germination of something new being born on the West Coast. Nobody ever references Madame Blavatsky, or rarely, when they ponder the question of this destiny that seems to hang over California. And yet, it's alluded to in The Secret Doctrine, and it was crystallized by Annie Besant. And this was earlier than anything else I've ever found. So her view and her understanding of America, as expressed in The Secret Doctrine and elsewhere, really was extraordinary. Hence, it's difficult not to ask, what would she think of us today? What would she think of us today? I would say that America's role as a womb for some kind of spiritual progress or cosmogenesis, America's role as a womb for that individually requires all of our protection. We are caretakers. We may not be able to control the process. We may be, like everyone else, swept along by vast currents of evolution, cosmic processes. But I don't think that we can appropriately shirk our role as caretakers of this womb-like state that HPB ascribed to America. And every individual has to decide what that means for him or her personally. I certainly can't decide that. The last thing on earth that I would ever do would be to stand up here and try to give some political speech, because there are lots of different policies that can work as long as they're intelligent, as long as they're well-intentioned, as long as they're executed with some degree of excellence. There's all kinds of policies that could work. And in this room, of course, like any room that you walk into, there's people with different points of view, different proclivities, different concerns. And the individual has to look into those things and make determinations on his or her own level. But I do feel that we as theosophists, we as spiritual seekers, we as people who may simply be curious about theosophy and other spiritual expressions in modern life, I do feel there's one pivot point around which we all must turn and dedicate ourselves, and I think it really truly honors the career of HPB and what she brought. And it's very simple, and that is the protection of the individual search for meaning. As long as we as a nation are protecting the individual search for meaning, I believe we're doing our jobs. We're doing our jobs. Vote how you want, live how you want, wear your hair how you want, whatever it may be. But I think that we honor this legacy that has been imparted to us, both from HPB and in the various forms that have given rise to religious freedom in America, to honor the individual search for meaning, to protect it. And I ask every one of you to arrive at your own personal definition of what that is. Obviously, there are policy decisions and things that go on in our world which we all participate in to some greater or lesser extent. But it's up to the individual to decide how to act on that ethic, the protection of the individual search for meaning. Without that, Madame Blavatsky never would have even come to America. She wouldn't have been able to write Isis Unveiled and co-found a Miracle Club and co-found the Theosophical Society and gather on the west side of Manhattan and say, we're going to ignite a revolution in this world. And she did ignite a revolution in this world. She also helped to ignite a revolution in India and in other parts of the East, as did Henry. None of that would have been possible. None of that would have been possible if they didn't look to the United States, at least for that pivotal few years of their career, that formative few years, as a place where the individual search for meaning was protected. So, in that regard, I suppose we can really see ourselves as caretakers. We have parts to play in this cosmogenesis that neither we nor any individual may be able to determine, any more than, salmon can determine the tides that they swim with and against. But we do have a caretaking responsibility. And if we engage in that caretaking responsibility, I think we are doing our part in the very best and very fullest way to honor the vision of America that Madame Blavatsky laid out in The Secret Doctrine. And wouldn't it be wonderful if future generations were to look back on our generation and say, they were caretakers. They did their job. There was a womb that was presented to them, and they took seriously the protection and the nurturing and the cultivation of that womb. And that job in its doing falls to each one of us as individuals. And in accepting that, I think we accept the wonderful, wonderful legacy that Madame Blavatsky bequeathed to us in The Secret Doctrine. And thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We have time for some exchange. We have about 15 minutes. This gentleman.
Wonderful presentation of where America is and can become. I have a question. I totally agree with you that it is our individual responsibilities. But in that context, what role does the Theosophical Society in America have to expound that to a public which I fear is forgetting its role and its responsibility to humanity?
That's a wonderful question. Wow. Well, I'll answer you from the heart, as I would if we were just sitting across a table. I think that TSA does a good job, and in some regards is doing a good job, in the excellence of its materials and presentations. For example, I'm not saying this to pat my friend Richard Smoley on the back or to hope that Richard will buy me a drink later. Which I will. I know he'll buy me several. But I say this honestly. I'm not trying to butter anybody's bread here. I say this honestly. I've said this in private to Richard. I've said it in private to other people. I happen to believe that Quest magazine right now is the best general interest spiritual magazine published in America. I really do. I really do. And if I may say, and again, I've said this in private, so you'll know that I'm not just trying to butter up my friend or pat him on the back, but Richard is one of the most important independent scholars of spirituality on the Western scene today. If I had to name a list of 5 truly, truly consequential people in bringing esoteric spiritual ideas to the public, Richard would, without question, always be on that list of 5. And TSA is so fortunate, I believe, to have Richard editing Quest, because there is very, very little in the way of general interest spirituality being published today. There's a few inspirational magazines, which are fine, but they have a more limited scope. There's some scholarly journals, which kind of go through ebbs and flow of quality. I think that the scholarly journals are impeded by a sense of ersatz seriousness. Like, we cover this, but we don't cover that. And it behooves us to always remember, and this is one of the things I learned from Krishnamurti, and it is so important. I feel like this has become the North Star of my life. Krishnamurti made the observation that the greatest drag on the individual's search is the wish for respectability. As soon as you start wishing for respectability, you start throwing things out. And Quest is possessed of real seriousness, not ersatz seriousness. And as such, its purview of subject matter is very broad. So I think that TSA deserves credit for doing a good job. Sure, there's always things that could be done more. Every spiritual organization in America today says, where are the young people? How can we get more young people in? And I'm not sure that's the right question, because I don't even know, quite frankly, that nowadays young people have a generational identity, as might have been the case, I don't know, back in the Woodstock days or what have you. I'm not even sure it was true then. I mean, there's young people who are evangelical, there's some who are New Age, there's some who just sit around playing video games all day. And, so I don't know that there's an identifiable kind of young person demographic. I think you can just hang out a shingle and do your best work. And I think that the conferences and the subject matter that's being put out, I think is of real quality. So I would say, there's reason for cheer there. There's reason to value it. It must be valued, and I think that's a good road to be walking down.
How do you push it forward to the general public?
That's a great question. I mean, I can only answer on an individual scale. And that is, in my own life and in my own career, the way I try to push things forward is I try to make sure my message is not only a quality message, but I never segment it by market. I mean, one of the things I'm personally most proud of in my career is that whether I'm at an academic conference or whether I'm on late night talk radio, I never change my message. I never change my message. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud of that. I don't say to myself, well, this is Harvard and it's time to, put on my good scarf. And, it's, I never change my message. And I think that, I don't know because others see us more clearly than we see ourselves, but I think people see an integrity in that. And I like when people are blunt, in their language, respectful, but blunt, and I don't think we should run away from the old language. I use terms like occult and ESP and medium or new age, terms that are sometimes held in poor repute because I feel they have historical integrity, and to run away from them almost concedes something to the cynics. So I don't think we should ever make concessions to the cynics. I think we should seek excellence and always, speak in a way, communicate in a way that's transparent and consistent.
Well, first, thank you, Mitch. I really appreciate that.
Truthful.
That comment. In a way, this is a follow-up question. There's a lot of are people hearing me? There's a lot of concern today among people about certain reactionary forces in our society today.
Yeah.
Would you correlate this with the idea of switchbacks that you mentioned in your talk?
It's a good question. I have one of the tenets of New Age culture, by which I mean the spiritual therapeutic culture. I don't use New Age in a negative way at all. One of the tenets is this idea that humanity is moving in this direction of evolutionary consciousness. And they don't really relate that directly to HPB. It's from HPB, but people don't recognize it as such. They think that idea has sort of always been with us, And I have a problem with that idea because, first of all, my problem isn't with the secret doctrine because the secret doctrine is written on such a vast scale, it's very difficult to say, well, this is happening Tuesday, Tuesday being 150,000 years from now, and, just these vast stretches of time that I personally can't conceive of. So my argument is not with the secret doctrine, but my argument is with people who see this as sort of a more measurable, near-term development. And I don't see that, in the near term. I don't see that in the near term. And I don't know. It's difficult to relate it to the secret doctrine for me only because the scale of time is so vast in the secret doctrine, and it's difficult sometimes to determine. Although I've done some of it, it's difficult to determine whether something relates to something that's traced out on such a vast arc of time. But I am profoundly concerned about it. I don't, again, without being nostalgic, I don't recognize the public discourse that exists in our country today apropos of what I knew when I was growing up. It was not all a bed of roses, by any means. And I don't mean to idealize it, and I grew up in a fairly typical Archie Bunker household in the borough of Queens. But, even in that Archie Bunker household, there were things that were never said. And in fact, there were things Archie would never say. And I think one of the reasons Americans loved Archie was that, yeah, he was supposed to be a bigot, but he really had a heart. And we all knew that, So we were all in on the joke, so to speak. And we've lost that today. And I truly, in my heart of hearts, I'm age 53, I don't recognize this public discourse from what I knew at age 13. And there are good things too. People feel more at liberty to pursue their own identities, and I applaud that. But this level of discourse, I simply don't recognize. And I'm not sure what I can say about it other than I feel very strongly that one must not participate in it. That doesn't mean desisting from politics or whatever it is you want to express or do in the world, but one must not participate in it. I don't believe in drawing walls either. It often surprises people to know the network of friendships that I have, and I spend time and exchange ideas and sometimes intimacies with people who might sometimes be considered among these forces of reaction. And I don't block off those friendships or those relationships, but I absolutely will not participate in or accept, within my immediate circle, any such activity. And I invite people, if they feel like it's the individual's decision, to take a similar vow. But it's profoundly disturbing, and there's no way around it.
Yeah, I'm not sure I really formulated my question right, because I really haven't had much time to think about it. But one of the things that I was thinking of relative to America is that I'm wondering about the metaphor. Is it a place or is it an idea? Because for one thing, if it's a womb, wombs exist in time, and I was wondering now the seeds or the children that came from that womb now are all over the world. Those ideas now are all over the world.
Yeah.
And the idea of focusing on the idea of America at particular time of a need for unity, is that the right focus?
Yeah.
Or is that what you meant, as a place or an idea?
That's a wonderful question. I could see it from different perspectives. Idealistically, I'm very, very sympathetic to the notion that it's an idea. That's my wish. But I would also have to say, in the Secret Doctrine, HPB does write, in terms of hardcore geology and place. She writes of Atlantis not as a metaphor, but as a place, Lemuria as a place, America and its, and the Pacific, from which she sees this womb arising, developing, as a place. So, I don't want to dodge the question by saying, well, it's both, but as an ideal, certainly it belongs to humanity. It belongs to humanity. But it is worth saying that in the Secret Doctrine, HPB did write, in terms of solid place. Hey.
Hi. So I'm thinking of several things that I think are tied together. One is I had a Canadian roommate years ago whose take on the U.S. was that, in a nutshell, was that the USA brings out both the best and the worst in people.
Yeah.
And I haven't
Where'd you
read
get that idea?
I haven't read a lot of HPB, but I can see a little of that in some of her writings. And I'm also thinking about Jung's concept of enantiodromia, which took me a while to get my head around. But it's basically that in the collective psyche, there always has to be balance.
Yes.
So what do you think about all that?
No, that's a wonderful, wonderful question. One of the things I say to people in terms of our current state in this country is that there's always going to be another side, and we have to be very, very conscious and careful to be aware of that. Because, as I was alluding before in response to Richard's question, I'm in a men's prayer group that has some political polarity in it, out in the world, shall we say, gently put. And I have friendships and I have relationships that people sometimes see as part of these forces of reaction. It's not, their views are not my views, but I do maintain these relationships. And some people come to me and say, how can you do this? Tell these guys to go to hell, And my response, and I hope this speaks to your question, is there's always going to be another side. And we have to get away from this idea, I believe, of eradicating the other side or not having any kind of contact or relationship with the other side so much as my wish, and I'm not in politics, and I have no intention of going there, but my wish, let's say, when I'm in my men's prayer group, is that I look at somebody who might be conventionally considered on the other side, and my wish is that he be the most ethical, the most clear-sighted, the most balanced person on that other side. You know, that's my wish for him. And of course, somebody could hit me with some extreme example and say, well, you know, what about this historical monster and that historical monster? And I would say, well, take a pause there, because most of us, most of the time, are not dealing with questions of ultimate evil in life. There are sometimes people in history who have had to deal with those questions. And it could be that when confronting such questions, self-defense comes to the forefront, and that something needs to be defeated in order to allow the community to survive and continue, as well as the individual. But if we leap to that place too quickly, I think we neglect the opportunity for our own development. You know, I'm not talking about wishing well whatever the most monstrous thing in history was that somebody could come up with. You know, I'm talking about my friend Mike, you know, from Waltham, Massachusetts, you know, and I may deeply disagree with Mike, but I recognize that there's always going to be another side. And we have to understand that. And people naturally, you know, politics plays on our fears, and political discussions, like discussions over money, almost instantly become emotional. And I think that we have to be very careful to understand that if it's the objective that the other side just not exist, then I think it violates the very thing to which you were alluding, that there's always going to be a yin and yang, call it whatever you want, there's always going to be another side. Yeah. It is 10:32, and I don't want to keep anybody from their service projects. That would seem rather contradictory to what I've been saying. So, but I'll be around. There's another talk tonight at 7 o'clock. Yeah. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.